Hello and welcome to today's ACM SIGSOFT webinar. This webcast is part of ACM SIGSOFT's commitment to provide value to its current and future members. The ACM SIGSOFT webinar series features speakers from the Future of Software Engineering track at the International Conference of Software Engineering, as well as selected keynote speakers and distinguished paper authors. I'm Sebastian Baltes. I'm an adjunct lecturer at the University of Adelaide in Australia and further work as a senior software engineer for QA in Germany. It is my pleasure to welcome you today to this ACM webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to quickly mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. First, the slides will advance automatically throughout the event. On the bottom panel, you will find a number of additional widgets and resources. If you're experiencing problems with slides or audio, press the F5 key on Windows, Command R on macOS, or refresh your browser on your mobile device. Or you can close and relaunch the presentation. To control volume, adjust the master volume on your computer. If you have questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A box at any time during the webinar and click the Submit button. At the end of the presentation, we will have time to respond to questions. This session is being recorded and will be archived. You will receive an automatic email notification when it becomes available.
Thanks, Sebastian, for that.
Oh, I think I still need to do the intro.
Go ahead.
Today's presentation is Revolutionizing Peer Review with the ACM SIGSOFT Empirical Standards by Paul Ralph. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Paul. He's an award-winning scientist, author, consultant, and computer science professor at Dalhousie University with a PhD from the University of British Columbia. His research intersects software engineering, human-computer interaction, and project management. It has been founded by Google and the Natural Science and Engineering Research Council of Canada and published in premier venues including IEEE Transactions on Software Engineering and the ACM IEEE International Conference on Software Engineering. Paul further chairs the ACM SIGSOFT Paper and Peer Review Quality Initiative. Paul, without further ado, take it away.
Thanks, Sebastian, for that kind introduction, and to everyone else, thank you for coming. If you have any problems with today's slides, you can find this presentation on the Empirical Standards GitHub repo. The address is here at the bottom of every slide. You'll also find our initial report there, which covers some issues we won't have time for today. Now, let's dive right in. The time has come to fundamentally redesign peer review to improve its fairness, inclusiveness, transparency, and effectiveness. The secret to this redesign is developing empirical standards. An empirical standard is basically a one-page checklist of specific expectations for a particular kind of study. Today, when a scholar peer reviews a manuscript, they must simultaneously generate and apply a set of evaluation criteria. The problem is that generating an appropriate rubric for judging research quality is mind-numbingly difficult. So reviewers tend to generate criteria that are incomplete, oversimplified, and inappropriate. It's not because reviewers are stupid, it's because no one person can generate good rubrics for all of the different kinds of studies software engineering researchers review. Furthermore, the reviewers, the editor, and the authors may construct totally different rubrics, and these rubrics may depart wildly from published methodological guidance or the norms of our scientific community. Most frustration with the peer review process comes from authors and reviewers disagreeing on what makes a study good. Meanwhile, the power imbalance between authors and reviewers makes correcting some, but not all, but some reviewers impossible. We need to change the process so that reviewers use the right criteria in the first place. The solution is for the software engineering community to decide together what good means. Furthermore, we can't just have a single definition of good because software engineering has such rich methodological diversity. For example, our expectations for a controlled experiment are very different from our expectations for a case study. So we need to create different standards for each common methodology. So in 2018, I assembled a task force of some of the best methodological experts in software engineering to draft the initial standards. These are just the names of the contributors to the complete drafts. There are another 20 or more people working on standards that aren't quite ready to use yet. To get a better idea of what these standards contain, Let's look in detail at the standard for questionnaire surveys. Each standard starts with the definition of the method in question. Next, the application section explains when to use the standard and refers to related standards. The point of all this is to make sure the reader is consulting the most appropriate standard for the study in question. Sometimes different researchers use inconsistent terminology around methods, and some people just seem a bit confused about which method is which. So we have tried to be very clear about when each standard applies. Next up, we have the heart of the standard, the specific attributes. These are our main expectations for this kind of study. We divide our expectations into three categories: essential, desirable, and optional. These are the essential attributes for questionnaire surveys. By essential, we mean that most questionnaire studies should exhibit these attributes. Put another way, researchers need good reasons for deviating from these, the essential expectations. For example, questionnaire studies should provide their instruments. Now, there are lots of studies where participants' answers can't be published for various reasons. But researchers would need a pretty strong justification to keep the questions secret. Sometimes an expectation needs an either-or clause. For example, questionnaire studies should use validated scales. But if not, they can demonstrate good construct validity after the fact, and that's okay too. Next, we have the desirable attributes. Desirable attributes are recommended, but not essential. They don't always apply, and some might be mutually exclusive. For example, most questionnaire survey papers should include demographic data, but we wouldn't necessarily reject a paper just because it was light on demographics. Similarly, the possible effects of incentives should be discussed, if incentives were used. But some questionnaires don't use incentives, and therefore wouldn't discuss them. Finally, we have extraordinary attributes. Extraordinary attributes are not required. Most good papers will not have these. Extraordinary attributes are the stuff that best paper awards are made of. Our main reason for including them is to emphasize that these things should not be expected by any venue and are in fact exemplary. A paper does not need extraordinary attributes to be published. But what we're trying to say here is, expect papers to have all the essential attributes. Papers missing essential attributes aren't ready for publication in any legitimate scientific venue. But don't expect papers to have all the desirable attributes. Most papers at top journals and conferences only have one or two desirable attributes. Some don't have any. Next, the standards discuss the general quality criteria appropriate to this kind of study. To be clear, we really want authors and reviewers to focus more on the specific attributes and less on general criteria. However, we include some general criteria to head off misunderstandings. For example, external validity is a common concern in questionnaire studies, but external validity is not appropriate for evaluating many qualitative approaches, which often embrace a different philosophical perspective. The Empirical Standards report is a glossary that defines many of these terms. The standards also include examples of invalid criticisms. This is our attempt to directly tackle some common problems in peer review. It's basically a no-no list for reviewers. For example, suppose a questionnaire finds that 60% of developers have had bad experiences with pair programming. I don't think that's true, I'm just making this up. But then the reviewer says, well, I've been pair programming for years and never had a problem. A mismatch between empirical results and the anecdotal experience of the reviewer is not a valid criticism. So we try to head this off with these lists of invalid criticisms. Finally, each standard contains a list of suggested readings and exemplars. Suggested readings provide guidance or discuss issues related to the method. For example, Wagner et al. 2020 is included here because it gives a lot of good advice for designing large-scale surveys. Basically, the suggested readings are an incomplete but useful list of what we think graduate students should read before attempting the method. Exemplars, in contrast, are good demonstrations of the method. The exemplars are not perfect and are included for different reasons. For instance, the Pandemic Programming Survey is a good example of explaining and justifying measurement scales, dealing with construct validity, and testing a priori hypotheses. It is not a good example of maximizing or measuring response rates. That said, if you're teaching a graduate seminar and you want examples to discuss and critique with your class, these exemplars are a good place to start. As of today, we have 8 draft standards plus the general standard. I'll come back to that in a minute. And several supplements for cross-cutting concerns like sampling and information visualization. 13 more standards and supplements are on the way over the next few months. Because of the high degree of methodological diversity in our community, we'll probably end up with 15 to 20 different standards. Now, these standards have many benefits. Providing the same specific criteria to authors and reviewers will reduce conflict, increase acceptance rates, simplify reviewing, and improve research quality. The standards will make the review process more predictable, reliable, transparent, and fair. They will also make science more efficient by reducing p-hacking, harking, publication bias, and revisions. You see, adopting empirical standards also allows us to transform the review process. Here's one way this could work. First, the journal or conference adopts the standards and figures out decision rules for accepting papers. A top conference like ICSE might have a rule like, accept every paper that meets all of the essential criteria and 2 or more desirable criteria. There might be more specific rules for deciding whether problems can be addressed in revisions or not. The venue then creates a review form, based on the standards. Meanwhile, the researchers are using the standards when they design studies and write up papers. You know what the reviewers will be looking for, so you make those elements really stand out in the paper. When you submit the paper, you might be asked some questions to determine which standards apply. Next, the reviewers read the paper and tick off all the essential attributes and any desirable or extraordinary attributes that apply. Most of the time, the reviewers will breeze through the essential criteria because the authors know exactly what the criteria are and will have made their presence obvious in the paper. The reviewers don't even make a recommendation. They just check the paper against the criteria. The decision to accept, invite a revision, or reject is baked into the venue's decision rules. Now, figuring out these review forms will be a bit of work. But after that, the review process will be much simpler. Reviewer consensus and first-round accepts will increase. So we won't need so much reviewer discussion or author responses or rebuttals or meta-reviews. Furthermore, and here's the key point, this process just won't allow reviewers to go rogue, invent criteria that do not accord with community consensus, or make unreasonable demands of authors. If it's not in the venue's decision rules, it just doesn't count. What we're trying to say is, we don't need reviewers to write 3-page-long essays about papers anymore. This is the sacrifice we ask of you. If you as an author don't want any more career-destroying, emotionally devastating, misery-inducing reviews for you or your students, then you as a reviewer have to accept a more limited role where you evaluate papers against a given standard instead of writing an essay. I know that for some people this is a big ask, but it's the only way to make sure that the next generation of scientists don't have to endure all the abuse that we did. Now, some of you may be worried that the standards impose an oversimplified, reductionist view of science. We've thought of that a lot. To prevent reviewers from using the standards in an inflexible, gotcha-like manner, each essential attribute is paired with a simple decision tree. When a reviewer indicates that a criterion is not satisfied, they will be explicitly asked whether there is a good reason, and maybe 1 or 2 other questions for clarification. This will help us avoid rejecting research that justifiably deviates from the standards. We can also use these decision trees to distinguish fundamental unfixable problems from superficial problems that can be fixed in a revision. Now, what about problems with the standards themselves? What if they don't really reflect our community's expectations? What happens when our expectations change? Creating these standards is not a one-shot deal. This is agile methods, not the waterfall model. As we all use the standards, we'll discover these inconsistencies and report them using our issue tracker. Every year, the standards will become clearer, easier to use, and more comprehensive. And every year, peer review will get more straightforward, transparent, and fair. Research quality will improve almost as fast as our collective mental health. Now, to reduce duplication, we also created a general standard with attributes that should apply to all empirical research. The general standard begins with initial checks for editors and reviewers. The editor's initial checks are basically desk reject criteria. For example, the editor should check whether the paper's topic is within the scope of the publication before reviewers are assigned. By asking you to review a paper, the editor should be implying that the paper is within scope. Similarly, reviewers should check for things like conflicts of interest before beginning a review. Next up, we have, again, essential, desirable, and extraordinary attributes. These have to be phrased very carefully because we have so much methodological diversity in software engineering. For example, the general standard doesn't say anything about how to analyze data. Only the paper should explain how the data were analyzed. The general standard's essential attributes are intended as replacements for typical criteria given at conferences. For example, the novelty criterion is forever being misused. So instead, we talk about whether the paper contributes to our collective body of knowledge. A replication, by definition, isn't novel, but it still contributes to the body of knowledge. If you are organizing a conference this year, we encourage you to use the general standard to write better instructions for reviewers. Ideally, the general standards will be used along with more specific standards. So a questionnaire study should comply with both the general standard and the questionnaire standard. That's why the questionnaire standard doesn't say states a research question. It's already in the general standard. I'm going to skip the desirable and extraordinary attributes for now, but a few key points in the general standard need highlighting. First, we take the position that there are no universal general quality criteria like internal validity. Such criteria are rooted in a specific philosophical perspective and don't apply to research that embraces different perspectives. Each study should be assessed on its own terms. Cross-paradigmatic criticism is not valid. Second, methods we have specific standards for are not necessarily better than methods we don't have standards for. Don't reject a paper because it uses a method we don't have a standard for yet. That would be crazy. You can always refer to the general standard. If there's no more specific standard, reviewers can refer to published guidance for that kind of research. Third, they're called empirical standards because they only apply to research that collects and analyzes data. Position papers, experience reports, and conceptual or philosophical scholarship are outside the scope of the standards. Please do not misinterpret the standards as repudiating non-empirical scholarship. Non-empirical scholarship just needs totally different criteria. Furthermore, the standards are intended for full technical research, not pilot studies, posters, or short papers. The general standard also discusses various research and reviewing anti-patterns. For research, we want to encourage researchers to do large, ambitious studies. Software engineering's culture of tiny pilot studies is really holding us back. For reviewing, we want to encourage detailed technical reviewing without nitpicking. Technical reviewing means focusing on methodological rigor. The standards help reviewers evaluate whether the work utilizes best practices for that kind of research. Going on and on about the way the paper is framed and positioned vis-a-vis related work is not technical reviewing. The difference between detailed reviewing and nitpicking has to do with whether something affects the main claims of the paper. Complaining about a few spelling errors, a missing legend in a figure, or missing reference is nitpicking because none of this affects the main claims of the paper, well, most of the time. Pointing out that the numbers in a table don't add up in a way that can't be explained by rounding errors isn't nitpicking because it might indicate a problem with the data analysis that could invalidate the main claims of the paper. We want detailed technical reviewing, not nitpicking. So that's the general standard. The standards are still in development, but they can already help you in many ways. Researchers can use the standards to design better studies. Remembering a dozen best practices is tough, and the attribute checklists are great memory aids. Authors can use the standards to justify their methodological choices. The standards report is also on arXiv, and there's a recommended citation on the GitHub repo. Reviewers, obviously, can use the standards as guides for evaluating papers, especially unfamiliar methods. Editors and conference organizers should contact me about adopting the standards. Frankly, the standards are so practically useful that reviewers are going to start using them whether you like it or not, so you might as well be proactive. Supervisors can refer their grad students to the standards to learn about methods and use the lists of suggested readings and exemplars for educational purposes. And everyone can report problems and make suggestions on the GitHub repo. Meanwhile, if you want to get involved, we need your help. To be clear, I am 100% not on board with academic elites imposing their view of research on everybody else in the community. This is a whole community endeavor. We need you to review the standards and report anything that's going to hurt your research program. We're working on migrating the standards to Markdown to facilitate community editing, and we need help with that too. We need methodological experts to help finish some drafts, including discourse analysis, qualitative simulations like protocol studies, and replications. If you'd like to contribute to any of these standards, please contact me directly. We need help creating decision trees for all the essential attributes. We need help building the system that turns the standards into evaluation forms for reviewers and pre-submission checklists for authors. And we need help getting all this to work with EasyChair, Hot CRP, Editorial Manager, and all the rest of them. Finally, please be patient. This is a huge project, and everyone's doing their best with their limited service time. To summarize, peer review is broken, but together we can fix it. Together we need to build consensus and make the standards reflect that consensus. Together we need to give up writing critical essays about each other's work and evaluate studies against well-defined criteria. And together we're starting a movement that's going to revolutionize peer review and fix major systemic problems in science. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you all for attending. Sebastian, do we have any questions?
Yeah, let's first do the thank you part. Thanks, Paul, for the excellent talk. And a quick reminder to the audience that if you have questions, then please just ask them using the interface, the Q&A box, and click submit. So let's start with the first question. Before we dig deeper into details of the standards, let's use this question. How do other disciplines go about this? Are they less diverse than software engineering? And do they have empirical standards? Yeah, and were there advantages, disadvantages being discussed in other disciplines?
Sure. So a few disciplines have generated something that they call empirical standards, but they're typically not as comprehensive as what we are creating. So the SIG-Plan community wrote a kind of very dense one-pager that they call empirical standards. And there are some journals and conferences well, mostly journals in biology and in medicine that use something that they call empirical standards. The difference is that software engineering has much greater methodological diversity than SIGPlan or than medicine. There's really only 4 or 5 kinds of study in medicine. There's like 25 kinds of study in software engineering. And so what happens is if you're like a medical researcher, and you need to learn how to review, controlled experiments, systematic reviews, panel studies, and maybe some epidemiological data science. But realistically, depending on what field you're in, you're probably only reviewing 1 or 2 of those ever. And so reviewers don't have so much trouble generating rubrics, and there's a lot more consensus in the field about like how to go about reviewing different kinds of papers. We don't have that luxury. We have people who are doing action research and grounded theory, and then we have people who are doing data science and controlled experiments. And these things are just so totally different that reviewers are always getting confused. Now, that said, empirical standards have met with a lot of positive results in other fields, but they are certainly not commonly used. So we're really breaking new ground here. Nobody has anything that's, the Empirical Standards report is 60 pages long. No one has anything that's anywhere close to that level of detail, as far as I know.
Then let's look at another question, which is basically the opposite direction. Do you think that these standards could apply to other disciplines? Or could be used in other disciplines as well?
So I have a mixed feelings about this. On the one hand, I think that a lot of what is in our standards can be applied to other disciplines. Certainly, similar disciplines like HCI could pick up a lot of this and run with it. But you can't just fork the GitHub repo and call it the HCI standards and then you're done, right? Because there's a lot of this stuff in the standards is really specific to the research context. And so if another field wanted to use our standards, they would have to make certain adaptations to make it appropriate for a different kind of journal or conference with a different domain of research. And the other thing is that there are types of research that are quite common in other fields that we don't do. Like HCI has usability studies. You don't see a lot of usability studies at ICSI. And so they'll need to have a standard for that kind of thing that we maybe don't really need, or maybe if HCI makes one, we'll just steal it from them so that we don't have to do all the work.
Okay, great. The next question is whether you see a risk that imposing standard criteria will stymie radically new research methods or approaches. And there's another question that's quite similar that is asking whether these standards could discriminate against researchers who invent new metrics. For example, if the criteria ask whether the paper satisfies the existing metric.
Yeah, so the general standard and the standards report try to tackle this issue head on because this is a genuine concern, right? So the general standard emphasizes, like it says explicitly, that we do not want people to use the standards to reject things that are just a little bit different. Right now, software engineering has a very high degree of methodological innovation. That innovation is not always moving in the right direction, but there's a lot of it. People do a lot of different stuff. And the general standard explicitly says, do not reject a paper just because it's a little bit different. Do not reject a paper just because we don't have a standard for that kind of study. What we want to do here is create a situation where at least 80% of the papers that are submitted to any major software engineering venue clearly fall into one of the standards that we have. And so when you're reviewing one of those papers that accords with the standard and that the authors say, use this standard to review it, then that's what you use. But when someone does something that's different, that's just not the usual way of doing something, or they find a whole new way of doing something, then the reviewers have to fall back on the general standard, which should apply to everything, and on their own sense and judgment. There's always going to be a small number of papers that don't fit with any of the standards and have to be reviewed in the old-fashioned way, the current way of just thinking about it and trying to see if it makes sense. I think, though, that the standards are going to help with that, because reviewing with the standards is basically a way of training reviewers to do detailed technical reviewing instead of the kind of superficial drive-by reviewing that we have now a lot of the time. The other thing is that with any study, all of the standards include this section, example deviations, right? And the point of putting that in there was to make it clear that in weird circumstances, reviewers might have to intelligently deviate from the usual way of doing things. And when they do that, the onus is on the authors to explain why they've done stuff in an unusual way. But that it is definitely wrong for reviewers to just say, this is wrong because it's different. And that whenever the reviewer notes, so this is the point of these decision trees, that when the reviewer says, look, this study does not comply with this attribute, then the system is going to say, okay, did the authors explain why they didn't comply with the attribute? And did they give a good reason? Does their reason make sense? Again, the standards do not seek to replace human judgment. We cannot replace human judgment in reviewing. There's not going to be any algorithmic reviewing. All we can do is direct human judgment so that people are judging the right things in the right way and that it's consistent. I know that was kind of a rambling roundabout answer, but I hope I hit the key points.
Okay, thanks. So now another doubt is that a standard by definition is inflexible, hence risky. And there's also an example in the question, random selection of participants is not always a good thing. How do we avoid to judge works on the standard and not on the actual specific work?
Okay, so the idea with the standards is that they are written very carefully not to impose restrictions that are too context dependent. So for example, nowhere in any of the standards does it say you have to use random sampling. The standards don't say that. The standards say things like, you should explain how you did your sampling. You know, now of course, not all studies have sampling, but suppose you're doing a questionnaire or something where sampling is really crucial to like the way that you do it. The standard doesn't say you have to do the sampling this way. The standard says that you have to explain how you did the sampling, you have to explain your goals, and the way that you did stuff has to make sense given your goals. And so the question to the reviewer is like, is it clear what the purpose of this is? Is it clear the way that it was done, and do they match? So we have been very careful to not use the standards to impose particular, very specific ways of doing things that don't always apply. But again, we've probably made mistakes in places, like the standards are going to be imperfect, right? And that's why the major focus on evolution over time. And I think it's worth saying that these standards are likely to evolve very quickly once we start adopting them, because you can imagine that if you are using this standard to write up a paper and you think that you've done all the stuff that you're supposed to have done, and then some reviewer comes along and says, nope, you didn't comply with this thing, and you don't agree with that, you're going to be highly motivated to put in an issue on GitHub and let us know that you're unhappy with the way the standard was interpreted. And so I imagine that once some major conferences and journals start to use the standard, and that's happening already, we'll be getting a lot of detailed feedback from people every time something goes wrong. And so as long as we keep adapting the standards based on that feedback and keep listening and keep improving, then these things are going to get very fine-tuned over the next few years.
Okay, thanks. Another question provides a bit of a different angle, whether the standard also mentions the ratio between reviews and submissions, or desired ratio of that.
The desired ratio between reviewers and submissions. Okay, the standards don't talk about this directly, but I'm going to weigh in on it anyway. So in studies of expert judgment, where you have an expert and you're trying to get the expert to evaluate something, the main thing that matters is that the experts agree. The way that you evaluate your measurement validity in studies of expert judgment is by checking the extent to which the experts agree. In this case, the reviewers are the experts. They're supposed to agree. Now, as everybody listening to this probably already knows, there have been several high-profile studies like the NIPS experiment that showed that in peer review is very unreliable, and the reviewers don't agree. Now, the thing is, when you have these experts in one of these studies, and they don't agree enough, there is a very clear playbook for how you deal with that. You have to keep making the guidance to the experts more clear. You have to ask more specific questions that are simpler, that have fewer points. So when you ask people questions on like a 20-point scale, they don't agree as much. So you have to reduce those scales down to like yes or no questions. You have to make those questions increasingly clear and keep adding decision rules and examples that show how you should make these decisions, how you should make each of these decisions, how you should make each of these evaluations. And if you as you keep doing that, agreement keeps going up and up and up. So the idea is that as the standards are deployed and implemented and reviewers get used to using them, the agreement between reviewers will increase. And that's a thing that we can measure quite easily because there's a whole bunch of yes or no questions. So the way that I think we should be doing things is, I think that we need to recognize that right now there's too much reviewing work. Because reviewers are overloaded. And so one way to proceed is to have to start with 2 reviewers, and if the 2 reviewers exhibit high agreement, then that's enough. If the 2 reviewers do not exhibit high agreement, that's when you start bringing in your 3rd reviewer. If your 3 reviewers don't exhibit high agreement, maybe you keep going until you get agreement. I don't know, but I think for most papers, once these standards come into effect, we'll only need 2 reviewers, because remember that one of the major purposes of these standards is to increase acceptance rates. We have this really silly system right now where everybody has to send everything to 5 or 6 different places before it gets accepted. That's dumb. It's inefficient and contrary to the purposes of science. We want to get into a situation where you basically know when you send a paper that it's going to be accepted, because the rules for accepting papers are made plain to you and you comply with the rules, and then you're done. And so, we're aiming for 80 to 90% acceptance rates because by using the standards. And so once we get those high acceptance rates, we don't need to have so many reviewers anymore. So one purpose of the standards and of using them in the way that I described in the presentation is to reduce the work for reviewers, because filling out a checklist is less work than writing an essay. The standards, because of their nature, make things like rebuttals and reviewer discussion and meta reviews and all that stuff, none of this is important anymore, right? And so all that can kind of go away. And another benefit here is that because the standards make the review process a lot less, make everything a lot less emotionally loaded, because there's no essay, there's just a bunch of tick boxes, right? And short 1-sentence explanations. So we are looking at a lot less resistance to open reviewing this way, because basically, like, once acceptance rates go way up, and once you take all of the emotional language out of the review process and all of the stress out of it, then people are going to have a lot less resistance to putting their name on things. And so hopefully we can get to a point where we don't have the blind reviewers anymore. Okay,
then we move on to the next question. What about the people factor? So we all have observed bad reviews in top conferences, and often the PC chairs seem to do nothing about that. So there's no real penalty for providing a crappy review even at top conferences. Is this somehow captured in the standards, or do you see any way out of this?
Yes, I absolutely see a way out of it. So the thing is that people think that, like, the editor of a journal or the program chair of a conference is this like all-powerful wizard who can chastise reviewers and fix stuff, right? And the thing is that from talking to, as part of this project, we interviewed a whole bunch of program chairs and editors to try to understand, like, why some of these problems were happening. And they don't feel like all-powerful wizards. They feel like they're caught in a bind where they have limited power to punish reviewers who do a bad job, because those reviewers are just other people in the community, and that will make enemies. And they are in a constant battle to get enough reviewers and enough PC members for all the journals and conferences. And so if you go around alienating and rebuking these reviewers, then all of a sudden no one will do reviews for you. So they don't feel like they have the power to do the things that we seem to think they have the power to do. So instead, we have to get into a situation where reviewers just like they just can't misbehave. So you can imagine this system where, there's no essay. You just have this paper and it says, is there a research question? Yeah, there's a research question. Check. Is the data analysis explained? Yes, it is. Check. And on you go down through this checklist. And when you note problems, you might get like a little box that gives you a couple, you write a couple sentences explaining the problem, but that's about it. There's just no place for you to go on a big rant. There's no place for you to impose criteria that you've just made up yourself. So there's just no room for reviewer misbehaving. Furthermore, I envision a system here where, like I said, we are not asking reviewers to say whether the paper should be accepted or not. We're just asking the reviewers, is there a research question, and does the paper refer to other academic articles? And, there's no place for you to say, this paper doesn't refer to my favorite paper that I wrote, and so I'm going to reject it. It's just not there. It's not in the decision rules that the venue makes. And so even if a reviewer decides to misuse one of the little text boxes to write a big rant about how they think the paper is all terrible and the authors are jerks, it doesn't count, right? Because that text doesn't affect the decision rules that make the paper so that it is accepted or rejected. So to a great extent, by redesigning the peer review process to have more structure, we remove the opportunity for the reviewer to misbehave. Furthermore, now you can think, okay, but reviewers, people are smart, and the reviewer could like sabotage the review and just like answer stuff in such a way as to get to know that the paper is going to be rejected if they want it to be rejected. The thing is that in a system like this, we can quite easily measure and very accurately measure the degree to which reviewers agree. And it's going to be pretty easy to start identifying problematic reviewers, because problematic reviewers are going to have a high rate of disagreement with the other reviewers around them. And it's quite easy to disambiguate that and like really nail down who is out of whack with everyone else. Now, just because somebody disagrees with the other reviewers doesn't mean that they're doing something wrong, because if you have one reviewer who has very deep methodological knowledge and other more so than the reviewers around them, they might disagree more because they just understand stuff better. But that's a thing that we're going to be able to figure that out by looking at the stuff that they wrote and by looking at the things that they select and by having a little intelligence about it. And so the whole structured review system should make it a lot easier for us to identify problematic reviewers and stop relying on them.
There are two more questions related to the role of reviewers. So when exactly is it that the reviewers have to make an expert judgment in this process if you use the empirical standards? And another question asked about feedback. So because reviews are not only about acceptance, but also about feedback. So I think both questions are about the role of reviewers here in this setting. Maybe you can talk about that.
Okay, let's do these things one at a time so that I don't get lost. Give me the first question again.
Yeah, the first one was about in which part of the process the reviewers have to do an expert judgment. So, for example, they could say, this is a boring, uninteresting hypothesis, but you followed the standards. So this would be an accept then without any further feedback. And the other question was about the feedback part then.
Okay, so so you're imagining this checklist, and let's hopefully everybody can still see. Let's go back to the questionnaire standard so we can remind ourselves what this checklist looks like. So we've got this checklist, and it says stuff like, step-by-step, systematic, replicable description of data collection and analysis. So, like, we need to be careful of the myth of objectivity here, right? All reviewing is subjective. Reviewers are always using their own subjective, fallible human judgment to figure out whether a paper is good or not. We cannot replace those subjective judgments. All we can do is direct them so that they're more about, you know, did the paper use the best practices for this kind of research, and less about a bunch of irrelevant stuff that we don't want. So we prompt the reviewer, you know, and ask, does the paper provide a step-by-step, systematic, replicable description of data collection and analysis? To answer that question, the reviewer has to use judgment. It's not an objective thing, right? Like, two people could reasonably disagree about whether the description is replicable, right? But nevertheless, this is a much more specific, answerable question than should we accept the paper or not. Should we accept the paper or not is too vague and too complicated and involves too many different concerns to expect high degree of agreement. So we're just trying to be more specific. Now, the second question is about feedback. So on the one hand, we don't want to stop reviewers from providing constructive feedback. What we want to do is stop reviewers from making unreasonable demands on the paper. So Sebastian and I have been working on a paper about sampling. And we recently got back some reviews that ask us to collect a lot more data. So we sit and look at that and go, wow, is that an unreasonable reviewer demand? So when we do if we use structured review and we use the checklist, the reviewers, there's just different ways to implement this, but it's likely that the reviewers have a kind of limited space to provide constructive feedback when that's necessary because too many reviewers provide destructive feedback. But the system itself provides a lot of feedback because if you think about it, you've got these decision trees that say, you know, if there's a problem like the research question isn't clear, you don't reject a paper because the research question isn't clear. You just ask the reviewer, you just ask the authors to make it more clear. So you've got this decision tree that if the reviewer says the research question isn't clear, it goes down to revision. And then there's this system that generates this to-do list that says the reviewers want you to make the research question more clear. So you are getting feedback on your papers, but that feedback is coming in the form of bits of the standards that aren't up to snuff. And so that feedback is it's not objective, but it is less emotionally loaded. It's just, there's this rubric, and you need to do better on this one, and that one. And so that is going to be a lot more, because the process is a bit more mechanical, and it has less emotional valence, it's going to be less upsetting. And it's going to be less frustrating. Because if the reviewers don't agree on something, like if one reviewer says that something has to be changed in one direction, and another reviewer says change it in a different direction, there's going to be this process by which those differing opinions have to be resolved into a clear to-do item for the author. So it won't be possible for you as an author to get conflicting requirements where reviewers ask you to do opposite things. It's not like right now there's this expectation that an associate editor or program chair or area chair or whatever, depending on the venue, is going to resolve conflicting feedback from reviewers. But the problem is that the chairs don't feel like they could do that. Like when on ICSI this year, I was the moderator for one paper, and basically like it wasn't clear how much authority the moderator had to resolve disagreements. So when the reviewers didn't agree, I wasn't sure how much I could it isn't clear that the moderator can just make the call and say, authors, you got to do it this way. It's just not. You're supposed to come to consensus, but sometimes people just don't come to consensus. So instead, we have this system where the reviewers tick the boxes and make some explanations, and then there's a reconciling system where before the decision can go out to the authors, any conflicting advice from reviewers has to be reconciled into one of the predefined rules that's in the reviewing system. I know I'm not explaining this as clearly as I might be, but it's because we don't have a prototype yet for this structured review system, and so some of this stuff is kind of hard to visualize until you've actually built it.
And there's another question about empirical evaluation, whether these standards have been somehow empirically evaluated, for example, by looking at accepted papers in the past or rejected papers in the past to see how the standards could have helped.
Okay, so empirically evaluating the standards is a great idea that I 100% support. Right now, all of my time is getting chewed up with trying to finish the 13 standards that are still under development. So I would love to work with somebody on conceiving of a way of empirically evaluating the standards. Right now, the standards are going to be recommended for the EASE conference that's running this year. And so we'll have a kind of lightweight evaluation where at the end of the EASE conference, we'll ask the authors and reviewers for their impressions of how the standards affected the review process. But that's not, like we can do better than that. We can do a lot more sophisticated evaluations of the standards, and I would really like to. But it's going to be a while because right now I got to prioritize, well, finishing the standards so that they can in fact be evaluated. Otherwise, we might have to do them one at a time. There is a study by Barb Kitchenham and possibly others, I can't remember who else was on that paper, where they had a checklist and tried to get their checklist, try to get reviewers to use their checklist to see if it would improve agreement, and it didn't. But there were some problems in that checklist that we have overcome now. Their checklist was like getting people to rate stuff on, on like 5-point scales, and there were a lot of criteria that were overloaded. Like they were a whole bunch of things mushed in together. And so in the standards we've created, they're all yes or no questions, and we try to keep the questions one at a time. We try to keep the criteria individual and atomistic. And in the standards, sometimes there's like 2 criteria smushed together, but when we translate that into the review form for the reviewers, we'll try even harder to make each question atomistic, singular, to only talks about one thing. And again, it's a yes or no binary answer. And so both of those things have been shown in other studies of expert judgment to increase reliability and agreement across reviewers.
Another question is whether using those standards makes the papers even less understandable to non-researchers, for example, industry people.
I can't imagine using the standards would make the papers harder to understand, because it will make the papers more similar. So like if you read some papers in medicine, or like in physics, although please everybody stop comparing software engineering to physics, because software engineering is nothing like physics. But if you read a lot of papers in physics and they're like 4 pages long and they're all really, really concise because they're all the same, because they all have the same structure, right? Similarly in medicine, because there's much higher similarity between the papers, you don't have to explain so much. You can just kind of get to the point. So I think the standards are going to make papers more clear and more similar. And like that, when I say more similar, I don't mean the study's more similar, although there's a little bit of that. More like the presentation is more formulaic. And there are downsides to more formulaic presentation, but they're outweighed by the upsides. The upsides are that like you can read and review research way faster. The other thing is that I don't think it's necessarily a good thing for a field to have industry people reading a lot of primary studies. If we want to get our messages out as a field, what's important is for systematic reviews to have easily readable summaries for practitioners. I mean, that's the way the Cochrane Library works in medicine, right? That it's the person who puts together the systematic review. They're the one who synthesizes the knowledge we've gained in the field and tries to present it to the practitioner audience in a way that they can easily understand. And the standards should help with that. Now, there's an opposite thing here that's got to do with like the standards making it harder for industry people to contribute to the community. And that's something that we've got to work on. On the one hand, the standards don't apply to things like industry experience reports. We don't have stuff for that. An experience report is outside the scope of the standard, and we shouldn't use the standards to evaluate it. But there's other things where, like, you have industry people who want to try to write a research paper. The thing is that in the short term, the fact that there is a standard and that industry people might not know about it could shag things up. But in the long term, the journals and conferences are going to make really clear that when you want to submit here, your work has to comply with this standard. And that's going to be, and the fact that there is this standard that's written down that you can read, that you don't have to get by osmosis from being in a community for 20 years, should make it easier for industry people to conduct and share their research.
There's a question about parts that are not covered by these standards. I mean, if you look at empirical software engineering at the journal, it's pretty straightforward because it's usually all empirical work. But what about ICSI, for example? And then you have papers that do not present empirical studies. Would this be a disadvantage for those papers when ICSI used empirical standards?
So we have a real problem in software engineering where some of our major venues have adopted the view, or not the view, but like a norm where it's almost impossible to publish a paper that doesn't have data. And that's not good for a field, right? Like empiricism, a commitment to empiricism, a commitment to empirically evaluating your ideas is good for a field. But there's also such a thing as conceptual research, and there's such a thing as a position paper. And sometimes position papers are really important because, like you can't always do an empirical study to back up a thing that's important for the field. Like, it could be important for me to write a paper about this empirical standards project to let everyone know how it works and the ideas and communicate it. And that we might not be able to mix that with a legitimate, like appropriately powered, good empirical study. So I think I can tell you what I would do if I was in charge. If I was the program chair of ICSI, I would split the technical track into an empirical track and other kinds of research track and a non-empirical scholarship track, because those things need totally different review processes. And if you are a scientist who does empirical research and expects all other research to be empirical, you probably shouldn't be reviewing position papers and the kind of conceptual, philosophical or theory-oriented research that we do in some parts of software engineering. Like, they just don't mix very well. And so I think that we need to some extent separate empirical from non-empirical scholarship, but also do a better job of making space for non-empirical research to have a voice. It's tricky. It's like non-empirical research should have a voice when it isn't possible to empirically study this thing. So there's lots of like meta-scientific things that are about like how to do research that you just can't study them empirically, but you still have to talk about them and think about them. And we need to make space as a community to publish those things. But we don't want to go making space as a community to publish pseudoscientific, evidence-free chin-wagging about how things should be done or how it was done back in my day. We don't want to make space for that. And that things that should have been empirical studies but aren't because people can't be bothered to do any research on it. And so it's a tricky thing, but the empirical standards explicitly do not apply to non-empirical scholarship and explicitly do not denigrate non-empirical scholarship. It's just separate. And so I think we need to keep it separate.
Okay, I'm afraid we are running out of time here. I'd like to thank Paul again for his informative presentation and insightful answers to the many questions. Special thanks to each of you, also to Verena, for taking the time to attend and participate and prepare today's webinar. We actually want to somehow collect all the questions that we couldn't answer and post some write-up somewhere. And also this webinar was recorded and will be available online in a few days on the SIGSOFT website. And you can find announcements on upcoming ACM and SIGSOFT webinars and other ACM activities at learning.acm.org and sigsoft.org. On behalf of SIGSOFT, the speakers, and myself, thanks again for joining us, and I hope you will join us again in the future. This concludes today's webinar.